The engine sputtered twice before giving out completely. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, exhaling sharply. The dashboard flickered, mocking him with its useless warning lights. He tried the ignition again, but the car responded with a dry, empty click. "Great," he muttered, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel. It was fitting, really. His car wasn't the only thing breaking down. Jake pushed open the door and stepped out, rubbing his temples as he glanced toward the house. Their house. The one he and Ethan had shared for 6 years, though lately, it felt like a cavernous shell. He should call Ethan, tell him about the car, ask for help. But he already knew how that conversation would go. Can't talk right now. Stuck in meetings. Call a mechanic. Ethan had become a stranger with a familiar face. The late nights, the distant looks, the empty side of the bed, things that once would have shattered Jake now barely stirred him. A voice cut through his thoughts. Trouble? Jake turned to see Ryan leaning against the fence, wiping grease-streaked hands on a rag. The man had the kind of presence that was impossible to ignore: broad shoulders, dark hair tousled by the wind, and a jawline sharp enough to carve stone. Jake had spoken to him only a handful of times, mostly polite nods or quick neighborly exchanges, but there was something about Ryan that always seemed grounded, solid, uncomplicated. "Yeah," Jake admitted. "Won't start. It's been giving me issues for weeks." Ryan tilted his head, considering. "Mind if I take a look?" Jake hesitated. His first instinct was to refuse, to handle it himself, to keep everything bottled up like he always did. But then he shrugged. "Sure, why not?" Ryan strode over, popping the hood like it was second nature. As he inspected the engine, Jake found himself watching him, watching the way his fingers moved with confidence, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something calming about him, something steady. "Your alternator's probably shot," Ryan finally said, straightening. "Might be the battery, too. Got time to run a few tests?" Jake glanced toward the house again, then back at Ryan. "I've got nowhere else to be." Ryan smirked, a small but genuine thing. In that moment, brief, simple, felt like the most honest exchange Jake had had with someone in months. A marriage in ruins. While Ryan retrieved his tools, Jake leaned against the car, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. No messages from Ethan. No missed calls. No "Hey, how's your day?" Just silence like always. Last night had been the same. Ethan had come home late, murmuring something about work, already halfway undressed before Jake could ask how his day had been. He didn't look at Jake the way he used to. Didn't touch him, didn't reach for him in the dark. Jake used to make excuses for it. Stress. Deadlines. The natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But he wasn't naive anymore. He knew when someone was pulling away. When Ryan returned, he worked in silence, methodical and patient. Jake found himself studying him again, noticing the roughness of his hands, the grease smeared on his forearm. The way he whistled under his breath like fixing cars wasn't just a job, but something he enjoyed. "You do this for a living?" Jake asked, just to fill the space. Ryan nodded. "Got my own garage a few blocks down. Grew up around cars. Fixing things kind of runs in my blood." Fixing things. Jake swallowed, the weight of those words hitting harder than they should. "Must be nice," he said, watching Ryan work. Ryan glanced up. "What?" "Knowing how to fix something when it's broken." Ryan studied him for a beat, like he was trying to read between the lines. Then he wiped his hands and leaned against the car next to Jake. "Most things can be fixed," Ryan said. "Just takes the right tools and a little patience." Jake let out a dry laugh. "Yeah? What about things that have been broken for too long?" Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Jake, really looked at him, like he could see the weight Jake had been carrying for far too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost careful. "Then you gotta ask yourself if it's worth fixing at all." Jake's breath caught. He had spent years trying to mend something that Ethan didn't seem interested in repairing. He had twisted himself into knots, making himself smaller, quieter, more patient, all in the hope that Ethan would turn back and see him again. But what if it wasn't meant to be fixed? Ryan turned back to the car, adjusting a few wires before gesturing for Jake to try the ignition again. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and nothing. Ryan sighed. "Battery's dead too. I've got a spare at my shop. I can grab it for you if you want." Jake hesitated. He should call Ethan. He should let his husband know what was going on. See if he even cared. But his fingers hovered over his phone screen, unmoving. He already knew the answer. Yeah, he said instead, glancing at Ryan. That'd be great. Thanks. Ryan nodded, tossing the rag over his shoulder. No problem. Be back in a few. As Jake watched him walk away, a strange thought settled in his chest. Something unfamiliar. Something dangerous. For the first time in a long time, someone had offered to help. And for the first time in a long time, Jake had accepted. And it terrified him. Jake hadn't expected to see Ryan again so soon. He told himself that the battery replacement was a one-time favor, that Ryan's kindness didn't mean anything beyond neighborly goodwill. But a few days later, as he stepped outside to grab the mail, he saw Ryan working on his own truck in the driveway. Their eyes met, and Ryan smirked. Car still running? Jake hesitated, then smiled. Yeah, you might be better than my actual mechanic. Ryan chuckled, wiping grease off his hands. I take pride in my work. It should have ended there, just another passing conversation, but something made Jake linger. Maybe it was the way Ryan didn't seem in a rush to get back to his truck. Maybe it was the simple fact that, for once, someone was talking to him without distraction, without checking their phone mid-sentence, without looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. Got time for a coffee? Ryan asked, nodding toward his garage. Jake hesitated. He should say no. He should go inside, go back to the empty silence of his house, go back to waiting for a husband who never came home on time. Instead, he said, yeah, sure. Ryan's garage was surprisingly neat for a workspace. Organized shelves lined with tools, a worn-out couch in the corner, a mini fridge humming softly. The scent of oil and metal lingered in the air, but it wasn't unpleasant. It smelled real, lived in, a stark contrast to the sterile, untouched spaces in his own home. Ryan handed Jake a steaming mug and sat across from him on the couch, stretching his legs out casually. So, Ryan said, taking a sip, tell me something about yourself that's not car trouble. Jake huffed a quiet laugh, swirling his coffee. That's about all I've got going on these days. Ryan raised an eyebrow. I doubt that. Jake hesitated, feeling the weight of the question settle over him. He could lie, say something easy, something shallow. But there was something about Ryan that made him want to be honest. Maybe it was the way he listened, like he actually cared about the answer. My marriage is complicated, Jake finally admitted. Ryan didn't flinch, didn't look away. Yeah? Jake let out a slow breath. Yeah, Ethan and I have been together for 6 years. And for the first few, it was good. Great, even. But lately, he hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't even know who we are anymore. Ryan nodded slowly, like he understood something Jake hadn't said out loud. That's a hard place to be. Jake looked down at his cup. You ever been there? A shadow crossed Ryan's face. Yeah, a while ago. Jake waited, but Ryan didn't elaborate. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Let me guess, he's always busy, right? Long hours, late nights? Says it's just work, but you can feel the distance even when he's in the same room. Jake's fingers tightened around his mug. Yeah. Ryan tapped a finger against the side of his cup, his expression unreadable. Ever think about walking away? Jake swallowed. All the time. Ryan studied him for a moment, then nodded like he understood. Like he had been exactly where Jake was sitting now. And for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel so alone. Lines that blur. The coffee became a routine. Jake found himself stopping by Ryan's garage more often, sometimes under the excuse of needing a quick check on his car, sometimes with no excuse at all. They talked about everything: cars, music, places they wanted to travel. Ryan told him about growing up with a father who expected him to take over the family business, about the first car he ever rebuilt from scratch, about how he once thought he had found the one until he realized love isn't supposed to feel like a slow suffocation. Jake didn't talk much about Ethan, but he didn't need to. Ryan seemed to understand the weight Jake carried without him having to explain it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Jake leaned against the hood of his car, sipping a beer Ryan had handed him. You ever feel like you're waiting for something to happen? Jake asked. Ryan tilted his head. Like what? Jake exhaled slowly. I don't know. Something. Anything. Just Proof that you're not crazy for feeling like this isn't enough anymore. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Jake, his gaze steady. I think you already have your proof. The words sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Because he knew. Deep down, he already knew. The first time it happened, it was barely anything at all. Jake had been laughing. Really laughing. Not the polite chuckle he reserved for forced conversations at home. And Ryan had reached out, thumbs swiping across Jake's jawline, wiping away a smudge of grease. It was nothing. A simple gesture. But Jake had frozen, because it had been so long since someone had touched him with anything other than indifference. And the moment Ryan realized it, his hand dropped, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Sorry, Ryan murmured. Jake swallowed hard. It's fine. But it wasn't fine, because later that night, lying in bed beside Ethan, who was turned away, lost in whatever world he lived in now, Jake could still feel the ghost of Ryan's touch on his skin. And he wasn't sure if he felt guilty about it, or if he wanted more. It wasn't an affair. Not yet. But something had shifted. Jake told himself it was just a friendship, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, he knew better. He knew that the stolen moments in Ryan's garage, the quiet conversations that stretched into the night, the way he felt more like himself in Ryan's presence than he had in years, those were all things Ethan should have been giving him. But he wasn't, and Ryan was. One evening, as Jake pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Working late again. Don't wait up. Jake stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he sent a text of his own. You busy? A response came almost immediately. Never too busy for you. Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. And then, instead of walking into his empty house, he turned around, toward Ryan's garage. Jake hadn't planned for anything to happen. That was the lie he told himself as he stood in Ryan's garage, watching him wipe his hands clean with that same oil-stained rag. The air between them was charged with something unspoken, something dangerous. Ryan leaned against his workbench, arms crossed. You okay? Jake exhaled, shaking his head. No, not really. Ryan didn't press, didn't demand an explanation. He just nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. Jake wasn't sure when his marriage had stopped feeling like home. Maybe it had been a slow unraveling, a collection of missed conversations, forgotten touches, nights spent waiting for Ethan to come home to a place he no longer seemed to belong. Maybe it wasn't one moment, but 1,000 little ones stacked on top of each other, until all that was left was silence and a bed too cold for comfort. Or maybe it was now, this moment, standing here with Ryan, feeling seen in a way he hadn't in years. Ryan tilted his head. Want to talk about it? Jake let out a bitter laugh. Not really. Ryan nodded again, taking a slow sip from his beer. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way that should have felt wrong, but didn't. Do you ever wish you could go back? Jake asked, staring at the ground. Before everything got complicated? Ryan took a deep breath, considering. No, he said finally. I think once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. Jake swallowed hard, because he knew Ryan was right. And the truth was, Ethan had stopped choosing him a long time ago. A night that changed everything. It started with a drink. Or maybe that was another lie, another excuse to soften the edges of what came next. But Jake had needed something to steady himself, something to quiet the voice in his head screaming that this was dangerous, that this was wrong, that this was the line he couldn't cross. But the truth? That line had been fading for weeks. One beer turned into two, into laughter that felt too easy, into glances that lingered too long. Jake knew he should go home, should turn around and pretend this night never happened. But then Ryan reached out, just a touch, just his fingers brushing against Jake's wrist. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a decision anymore. It felt inevitable. Jake, Ryan murmured, his voice lower now, rougher. Jake swallowed, heart pounding. Yeah? Ryan hesitated, his hands still hovering, his eyes searching Jake's like he was giving him a chance to walk away. Jake didn't, because he was tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of hoping for something that wasn't coming back. Tired of being alone in a marriage that felt more like a memory. So when Ryan leaned in, when his lips brushed against Jake's, soft at first, testing, giving him space to pull away, Jake did the opposite. He closed the distance. And for the first time in years, he felt something other than empty. Jake woke up to the scent of coffee and the weight of regret pressing against his chest. Sunlight filtered through the garage's side window, casting long shadows across the space. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, before the events of last night came rushing back. The kisses. The way Ryan's hands had traced his skin like he was something worth holding. The quiet whispers against his neck. Words that made him feel like he wasn't just someone waiting to be loved again. And then, Jake sat up abruptly, his heart hammering. Ryan was in the small kitchenette, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. He turned when he heard Jake stir, his expression unreadable. "Morning," Ryan said, his voice softer than usual. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his breath unsteady. He stopped. What was there to say? Ryan nodded, as if he already knew. He crossed the room, setting a cup of coffee on the table beside Jake. You don't have to explain anything. But that was the problem. Jake wasn't sure if he wanted to explain or if he wanted to stay. Because last night hadn't been just about desire. It hadn't been some impulsive mistake, something fueled by loneliness and resentment. It had been something real, and that terrified him. By the time Jake got home, the guilt had settled into his bones. The house was silent, just like always. Ethan's absence was predictable, expected, but this time, it didn't sting the way it used to. It didn't feel like a betrayal, because now, Jake had his own. He dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter and stared at his reflection in the window. His face looked different, tired, conflicted, but something else too. Something he hadn't seen in years. He looked alive. The sound of the front door unlocking made him tense. He turned just as Ethan walked in, looking exhausted but otherwise unaffected. He barely glanced at Jake as he set his bag down, already loosening his tie. Long day? Jake asked, his voice steady. Ethan sighed, rubbing his forehead. Yeah, you wouldn't understand. Jake flinched, not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily Ethan said them. Like he had already decided that Jake was someone who couldn't possibly understand. Like they were nothing more than strangers. And in that moment, Jake knew that the guilt he felt wasn't because he had betrayed Ethan. It was because, for the first time, he had chosen himself instead. Are you happy? Jake asked suddenly. Ethan frowned, caught off guard. What? Are you happy? Jake repeated, his voice firmer now. With us. With this. Ethan hesitated. And that pause, that hesitation, was all the answer Jake needed. Because Ethan hadn't said yes. And maybe he never would. Jake inhaled sharply, feeling the weight of his decision settle in his chest. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't waiting anymore. Jake didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of Ethan breathing beside him. It should have been comforting, the familiar presence of the man he had built a life with. But it wasn't, because now there was a crack in the foundation. A crack so deep he wasn't sure it had ever been solid to begin with. His mind kept replaying last night. Ryan's touch, the warmth of his breath against Jake's skin, the way his lips had traced the outline of a man who had spent years feeling invisible. The way he hadn't hesitated. Jake turned his head, watching Ethan in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. For years, he had been waiting for Ethan to turn toward him like this, to reach out in the dark, to pull him close, to make him feel like he mattered. But he never did. And now, Jake finally understood why. He was done waiting. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee when Ethan walked in the next morning. He looked exhausted, hair still damp from the shower, tie half-knotted like he was already somewhere else in his mind. Jake watched him from the counter, fingers curled around his steaming mug. I need to talk to you, Jake said, voice steady. Ethan barely glanced at him as he reached for his phone. Can it wait? No. Something in Jake's tone made Ethan pause. He finally looked up, brow furrowed. What's going on? Jake set his coffee down. He had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head, imagined different ways it could go. He had thought about yelling, about accusing, about throwing all the hurt and neglect back in Ethan's face. But in the end, all he felt was exhaustion. We're not happy, Jake said quietly. Ethan exhaled sharply. Jake, when was the last time you even noticed me? Jake cut in, his voice calm but unshakable. When was the last time you looked at me and saw me, instead of just the person you come home to when it's convenient? Ethan looked taken aback, like he hadn't expected Jake to say the words out loud, like he hadn't realized Jake had been holding them in for years. That's not fair, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. I've been busy. Work has been. It's always work, Jake said, not with anger but with finality. And I told myself I was okay, that I could handle it, that eventually you'd come back to me. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't argue, because deep down they both knew it was true. Jake swallowed hard. I don't think you want this anymore. Not really. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Ethan looked away first. And that was the answer. Jake nodded to himself, his heart pounding but his hands steady. I'm leaving. Ethan's head snapped back toward him, eyes widening. What? I can't do this anymore, Jake said simply. And I don't think you can either. We've just been pretending. Ethan stared at him, like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to say something to fix this. But the words never came, because there was nothing left to fix. Packing was easier than Jake thought it would be. Most of his things were already his: clothes, books, personal belongings that had never truly merged with Ethan's. The house was full of shared spaces, but very little of it felt like his. And maybe that was why leaving didn't feel as painful as he had imagined. Ethan lingered in the doorway as Jake zipped up his bag. Where are you going? Ethan finally asked. Jake hesitated. There were 1,000 ways to answer that question. He could tell Ethan the truth, that he was going to Ryan's, that he wasn't sure what came next, but he knew it wasn't this. But in the end, Jake just said, somewhere I don't feel alone. Ethan flinched, and for a moment, Jake saw something crack in his expression. Maybe regret, maybe realization. But it was too late. And for once, Jake wasn't going to wait for Ethan to catch up. Ryan didn't look surprised when Jake showed up at his door. He didn't ask questions, didn't push for explanations. He just took one look at Jake, at the packed bag slung over his shoulder, at the exhaustion in his eyes, and stepped aside, silently inviting him in. Jake hesitated for the briefest moment, not because he doubted his decision, but because this, whatever this was, felt terrifying in a way he hadn't expected. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt like freedom. Ryan met his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, Jake saw certainty reflected back at him. You sure? Ryan asked, voice steady. Jake exhaled, something in his chest finally unraveling. Yeah, he said, I am. And as Ryan closed the door behind him, Jake knew he wasn't looking back.